When it comes to talking about Rav Shlomo Elyashiv, the Leshem Shabbai V'Achaloima, who is referred to as the Baal HaLeshem based on the name of his Svarim HaKadoshim, it's a ridiculous attempt to try and even begin to talk about such a giant in an hour. The Leshem gave us a gift, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a gift with the Leshem. It's difficult to find another tzaddik, another mechaber, in particular in the world of Pnimiyas HaTorah, who simply gave us so much. The Leshem did not need to give us what he gave us. The Leshem was zocha in his lifetime, as we're going to see, to experience the lights of Gan Eden already. He felt it. He lived there. He lived in those spiritual places that he wrote about for us, because someone who didn't live there could not write or speak about the things that the Leshem spoke about. And when it comes to the avodah of tzaddikim, the work of tzaddikim, the goal very often is to ascend upwards, to move upwards, to leave this world, to leave the confines and the difficulties of what it means to be a human being, a neshama stuck in a body, where the neshama, our tzaddikim tell us, is always constantly trying to ascend out of itself, yet caught within itself, engaging in this ever-present to and fro movement that's Ratzav V'Shov. But when a tzaddik is zocha to be ola lamala, when a tzaddik merits to see the oros ha'elyonim, these spiritual lights which we have absolutely no grasp of, sometimes the tzaddik stays there, and they live in their inner world. Now, there are certain tzaddikim who have talmidim, and those tzaddikim are forced to move out of their inner world because their talmidim are desiring from them. They're begging them. And Chazal tell us that just as the calf wants to drink, the mother cow wants to feed. And when there are talmidim, when there is this instigation and movement from below, so there's a descent of lights from above. But the Leshem didn't have that. The Leshem didn't have talmidim. The Leshem didn't have a yeshiva. The Leshem was not teaching Kabbalah Berabim. But nevertheless, the Leshem ascended above. He was ayil. He went up to those worlds. And he was also nafak. He came back down. And he came back down and wrote it all down for us. He wrote everything down. He did not leave anything that wasn't explained. And the Leshem throughout, even though it's very rare to get a glimpse of the autobiographical light of this tzaddik, whose personal life is shrouded in more mystery than the concealed secrets that he speaks about so openly, the Leshem will sometimes say that this is a very deep secret. This is something that I shouldn't be speaking about. This is something that I don't want to be speaking about. Yet nevertheless, I don't have a choice. I have been chosen to speak. I have been given the strength to speak. Any insight, any information, any havana or understanding or grasp of Pnimiyas HaTorah that I have, says the Leshem, is simply for the sake of sharing it with those who need it. And the Leshem, because he didn't have a yeshiva in his lifetime, because he didn't have those students in his lifetime, we were zocha to become his students. Because the Leshem allowed blank pieces of paper to become the receptacle for his Torah. And he wrote everything down. He prepared his own ink. He was tovel in the mikveh before he made his ink. He engaged in kavanos of preparing ink. And his very close friend and student, Rav Aryeh Levine, the tzaddik of Yerushalayim, records that the Leshem himself wrote more than a human was supposed to be able to write. That somehow, some way, the Leshem was writing in a way that was almost superhuman. Something referred to as hashpa'as hakalmus, almost taking control, allowing the pen to have control taken over it. And so we have to be makir tov for the Leshem, because the Leshem gave us everything we needed, and he left himself in his books. Now, Rav Shlomo Elyashiv was born in the year 1924 in Zagori, and he studied under his father, Rav Chaim Chaikel, for a number of years before being sent to Telz. Telz was a hub of Musar at that time. It was also where the Leshem became known as an Eloi, a genius of sorts, who understood not only the depths of the inner teachings later on in life, but the depths of the revealed teachings as well. He was known as the Eloi of Telz, which means he was the genius in the Beis Medrash. He was the one who knew it all. And his Rebbe at the time, who was not in particular associated with Pnimiyas HaTorah, exposed the Leshem to these teachings. He introduced the Leshem at a young age to the teachings of the Arizal, to the teachings of the Vilna Gaon, and to the teachings of the various Mikubalim of Moshe Cordovaro, the Ramami Panel, the different giants throughout Jewish history. And then legend has it that one night the Leshem was in the Beis Medrash and tells, and he saw an anonymous individual who seemed to be a Poel Hayom, a day worker, who was sitting in the back of the Beis Medrash saying Tehillim all day. And eventually the Leshem garnered the courage to approach this individual because the Leshem understood that there was something special about this person. And he asked him to initiate him, to teach him, to bring him in. The Leshem understood that this was a concealed tzaddik, that this was a hidden tzaddik. And this tzaddik, before the Leshem even began to learn the Aleph Beis of Kabbalah, this tzaddik said, I will only learn with you Shar HaYichudim. I will only learn with you the part of the Arizal that talks about meditation, that talks about the ability to cleave one's mind to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And even though that's typically the last thing that a person learns, the culmination of the process of studying Kabbalah, for the Leshem, that was the very beginning. Almost as if to teach us that the Iker, the essential purpose behind learning these ideas or studying these ideas of Pnimius HaTorah is not, God forbid, simply for the philosophical speculation of it all, or even the divine contemplation of it all, but rather the goal is to be miyachid yichudim. The goal, like the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh taught us, is to draw the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu back down into our lives down here, back down into the difficult confines and contours of this worldliness, which appear to be the direct opposite of what Kedusha is. And the Leshem expresses explicitly something remarkable. He says, every statement ever expressed by the Arizal, any concept, no matter how high, no matter how lofty, can be applied to human experience, can be engaged with by way of yichudim, can be contemplated in a way that it becomes something that animates the individual's life itself. The Leshem developed a name for himself as somebody who really understood what the Arizal was coming to say. And even though the Leshem didn't have students in the typical sense, the Leshem did serve this remarkable role of being a point of contact for Gedolei Yisrael to come and understand Kabbalah. The Chafetz Chaim sat and learned with the Leshem. Rav Elia Lopian sat and learned with the Leshem. Rav Yosef Bloch sat and learned with the Leshem. Rav Yerucham Levovitz, the Gedolei HaMusar, that world of Lithuanian Jewry. Rav Yisrael Salanter, the legend has it, spent time by the Leshem Shbei V'Achaloima. In addition to that, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, the Ra'ayah HaKadosh Rav Cook, when he was a young Rav in Europe, he asked for a month off from his Kehillah to clarify certain questions that he had in Kabbalah. And they sent him to sit with the Leshem, and he sat for a month at the feet of the Leshem, which was the birthplace of a relationship that lasted until the end of the Leshem's life. It was Rav Kook who got the Leshem to Yerushalayim towards the end of his life. The letters and the powerful letters of love that were sent between these two tzaddikim, the Leshem and Hara'ayah, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, are so filled with passion and devotion to one another, to the extent that it's my humble opinion that the Torah of Rav Kook is so clearly influenced by the Torah of the Leshem Shebei V'Achaloima that without the Leshem, I don't think we could have had a Rav Kook. This person, this Leshem, eventually makes his way to Eretz Yisrael towards the end of his life, where he once again reunites with his close friend, Rav Kook, and Rav Aryeh Levine begins to be Meshamesh him. Rav Aryeh Levine wrote some of the very little biographical information that we have about the Leshem. Rav Sraya Dublitsky also wrote a book. But what Rav Aryeh Levine describes is that this was a person who was not of this world. Rav Aryeh Levine records that he heard in the name of Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, Zchusei Yagen Aleinu, a main disciple of Rav Kook. He said, what can I say about the Leshem? What can I possibly say about the Leshem? This is a person who strolls throughout Gan Eden HaElyon like we walk along the street. He said, while the Leshem is jumping and leaping in the supernal worlds, we're simply strolling along down here. The Chafetz Chaim said about the Leshem, he says, pay very close attention to what you merit to see in this world of this tzaddik, because in the next world, we're not going to be able to see him. The Leshem was a person who history did not allow human beings to understand what they had. But we now have the ability to understand what we have. We have the books. Rav Moshe Shapiro, Zchus Yagan Aleinu, wrote that very often the author and the book are disconnected from one another. There was the author, there was the neshama of the tzaddik, and then there was the books that tzaddik wrote. He says, but by the Leshem, and this was a sentiment that was brought up by other people as well, that distinction is not so clear. When you learn the writings of the Leshem, you are encountering the Leshem, because the Leshem placed his neshama into these books, similar to the works of Rabbi Nachman, similar to the works of Rabbi Nassan, that the neshama of the mechaber is there, like Gemara tells us that when a person is learning from the book of a tzaddik, they should see to it as if that individual is right in front of them. Like the Arizal tells us that before one enters into the study of the inner teachings of Torah, the tefillah that we ask of Hashem is to allow our souls to be bound up with the souls of those tzaddikim through whom these teachings have been revealed. To allow our souls to connect to the fact that there were these tzaddikim in the world who understood what HaKadosh Baruch Hu meant, who knew beyond a shadow of a doubt with the depths of their emunah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is present in everything. And when we open up these books, we encounter that light. It's a beautiful story. There's not many stories about the Leshem, but there's a beautiful story told over by Rav Tzvi Neria. Tzvi Neria, who was again a Talmud of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who understood the power of the Leshem because of the legends of Yerushalayim of that day. People knew of the Mekubal of Yerushalayim. That one day Rav Tzvi Neria, as a young child, followed along, tagged along with Rav Aryeh Levine to go and visit this Mekubal, the Leshem Shabbai Bachaleima. And Rav Neria poked his head in as a young child, and he brought the chutzpah up in himself to ask for a bracha. And he said to the Leshem, I want a bracha in ruchnius. I want a bracha in spiritual matters. And the Leshem looked at him incredulously almost, and he says, I don't understand what you're asking. By me, there's no distinction between ruchnius and gashmius. A bracha in gashmius is also a bracha in ruchnius. A bracha in ruchnius is also a bracha in gashmius. Because with the perspective that one gains when properly entering into the teachings of Kabbalah, in particular the teachings of the Leshem, is that there is nothing that is removed from the purview of Kedusha. We can find Hashem up there, we can find Hashem down here, we can find Hashem everywhere, because ultimately everything that we see is suffused and infused and sustained and kept up by the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Leshem, again, the Leshem really left himself anonymous. So we're forced to kind of search out certain ramazim to the life of this tzaddik. The title Leshem Shabbai Va'achaloima, the third row of stones in the Choshen Mishpat, the Leshem describes that he chose that name because his name and the name of his father are found in the permutations of those letters. But there's deeper hints to this as well. There are deeper hints to this. The fact that the Leshem named his Sefer, Leshem Shabbai V'achaloima, is hinted in the fact that the stones of the Leshem Shabbai V'achaloima are associated with the Shevet Dan. Shevet Dan, the Leshem, when tracing his lineage, makes it very clear that he is attaching himself to the Shevet of Dan by connecting himself to Rav Shimshon of Astropolia. And the idea of Shevet Dan is the Ma'asef L'chol HaMachanos. That Shevet Dan were that Shevet that were Oived Avodah Zarah. They were the ones who were kicked out of the protection of the Ananei HaKavod, attacked by Amalek. Hanechashalim Acharecha, the tzaddikim tell us, was the Shevet of Dan. Dan is from the language of din, of severity. They were the lost tribe. They were those who felt spit out from holiness. Yet nevertheless, the Shevet of Dan had a remarkable role. The Shevet of Dan's job was to collect the lost objects of the Jewish people and to return them to their rightful owners. That which took place by Shalosh Regalim, when we would retrieve our lost objects. And as Rabbi Nachman tells us, that the Iker avoda of a Jew in this world is to find their lost objects, because all of our lost objects, all of those dreams that we've lost, all of those hopes and aspirations that have fallen into decay, when we retrieve those lost objects, we're retrieving parts of ourselves, we're retrieving our emunah. And when a person studies the writings of the Leshem, as we're going to see in a moment, there's something remarkable about the Leshem. Because the Leshem, for all of the light that the Leshem was bringing into the world, when you look at the Leshem's writings, what you encounter is a very intense focus on Gevura, on severity, on constriction, on difficulty, on concealment, on the nature of the shattering of the vessels, the death of the primordial kings, the trauma that gives birth to reality, the breaking that takes place in order to give birth to the space that we live in. Nobody like the Leshem has spent as much time in those sugyos. Perhaps the Mittler Rebbe, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe. But in my humble opinion, nobody has spoken this deeply about this sugya of severity like the Leshem. But for the Leshem, severity is not severity. Severity is the vehicle, Gevuros are the vehicle through which we encounter the deepest joy imaginable. Because when we're capable of drawing the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu down into the darkness of our lives, down into the Gevura of our experience, down into the severity and the intensity, and we allow that to become a vehicle that reveals a deeper expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Gevuros themselves transform into the sweetest pleasure imaginable, into the deepest revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself in light, in easy things, in yichud, in unity, when everything is clear and present and clearly rooted in Hashem, so that's a tremendous thing, but it's not such a novelty. It's not so surprising that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could reveal himself through the light. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself even in darkness, in constriction, in concealment, in Gevura, in Tsar, in Yisurin, in suffering, that's a bigger chiddush. Because what the human being is now capable of saying is, Hashem, you told us that you could only be found in the light. But when we truly understood what you were and who you are and what you want from us, we come to find that you're found in the darkness as well. And in that moment, we intensify the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We say, Gam choshech lo yashchich mimcha. Even darkness is not dark to you, Hashem, because even the severity of human experience is simply the birthplace of throwing ourselves into a deeper faith. And this was the avoda of the Leshem. The avoda of the Leshem in his svarim was to show us how all of those difficult sugyos, all of that intensity and severity, all of it, in a person's life, in Kedusha, and anything a person encounters, are simply opportunities for an individual to transform that situation into light, to reveal HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence there. The Leshem uses a very powerful lashon that I haven't seen in other svarim. And the Leshem only does this when he allows himself. There are times in the Leshem's writings where he allows himself to lose himself in the writing, so to speak. And the writing almost takes on a confessional form. It becomes tefillah. The Torah is nishapich into tefillah, and we get to encounter the Leshem davening in the middle of his writings. And very often he says, Hashem yisbarach yichaper ba'adi. Hashem should forgive me for revealing so much. And then when he gathers himself together again, the Leshem uses a language of al kol panim. After writing very lengthily, after spending a lot of time expressing an idea, the Leshem will come back and say al kol panim, almost as if telling us that even if you couldn't follow everything, nevertheless, you can still grab hold of this point. And the Leshem says, ki hakol hu bakol. Ultimately, everything is in everything. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinite presence is so annihilating that there is nothing in this world, no situation, no opportunity, no difficulty, no moment of Yisurim that cannot be broken open to reveal the light of the infinite within it. That's what the Leshem came to teach us, that al kol panim, even if you missed the whole show, even if you've missed everything, nevertheless, if you grab hold of that tiny point at the end, you're still connected to the essence. You're still connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Leshem, we can say, spoke about three elements. The Leshem wrote 4 big svarim. The first one was called Hakdamus U'Sha'arim, an introduction to the Kabbalah of the Arizal. And the Leshem Schusi Hagen Elenu writes in the Hakdama over there, he says, I'm writing this because apparently there are a lot of people who are not spending time studying the inner teachings of Torah, and they claim that they don't have enough time. Therefore, this book contains everything you need. So learn this book. And then he goes on to say, and even more so, when you learn this book, you'll realize that you have a lot more time than you thought you did, because you'll taste the sweetness of the Eitz HaChaim. You'll taste the sweetness of Gan Eden in this world, and you'll be able to find more time for it. Because for the Leshem, the teachings of Kabbalah were not simply descriptions of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu interacts, but rather when one enters into these teachings, when one enters with their mind and their heart, and they focus lishma on what they're learning, the individual is quite literally transformed in their mind to that place that they're learning about. Like the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh taught us, a person is found where their thoughts are. The Leshem taught us about Limud HaTorah. What you are learning is where you are. And when you speak these words, and when you study these words, and when you believe in these words, or when you speak them in order to believe them, ha'amanti ki adaber, we are transported. Are our bodies transported? No, that's not the ikr. The ikr is not to experience mystical experience or whatever that might mean. The ikr is to sit, study the ideas, and when our mind is connected to the concept, at that point there is a yichud that takes place between our soul and the infinitude of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that even though we can't see it, feel it, smell it, or taste it, it's happening. And with the amunah that it's happening, when a person is learning the words of the tzaddikim, everything is okay in that moment. When a person loses themselves in these holy texts, when a person loses themselves in the ink that is spilled in order to share these secrets with the world, everything is fixed in that moment. The next moment is broken. It's just another opportunity to fix. This is what the Leshem was giving us. And it's for this reason that I think the Leshem is so associated with Shevet Dan. Because just like Shevet Dan was coming along to retrieve those lost objects, to take that which appeared to be lost and say, no, in truth, it's still present. It's still here. Even though you felt those were lost experiences, nevertheless, they were still connected to Kedusha. Here, take your lost object and realize that you can now thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for finding your lost object. The Leshem is doing that with Gevura, with severity. The Leshem is teaching us that, yes, the world will appear very dark very often. And that's because the way the world came into being was very dark. But nevertheless, there's a way of being mamtik everything. There's a way of taking those gevuros, that severity, and saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like Rabbi Nassan taught us, Yesh inyan sheyitapech hakol. There is a concept that transforms everything to sweetness. And when a person learns the writings of the Leshem, this is apparent. The Leshem teaches us about the beginning of creation, how creation started, how HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed the world to be built. And what we find is that it was a disaster. When a person looks at the writings of the Arizal, or a person looks at the writings of the Leshem, in particular his book, Drushe Olam HaTohu, or Sefer Hadeya, which was the second Sefer, what we find is that the world was created through trauma. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted light, the expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to find Kalim. Something went wrong, so to speak, and those vessels shattered, creating what we would eventually understand as our world. So it turns out that trauma is not something that happens to life. Trauma is the very birthplace of life. The shattering, that brokenness, those dinim, that intensity, that too muchness, that not knowing, that tohu, that concealment, that chaos, is the very birthplace of creation. That is what gives birth to everything. We're still in it. Every element, every moment in history, every moment in an individual's life, every particular emotion and feeling that that person has, says the Leshem, is still part of the process of tohu. It's part of the process of chaos allowing itself to emerge into existence. So when a person studies this, a person begins to think, how is this possible? How could this be how the infinite HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to create the world? Through darkness, through concealment, through shattering, through trauma? And the Leshem says, this is obviously more understandable, because when we look at the world, says the Leshem, what do we find? We find darkness and concealment. The Leshem says, if we really take a good accounting of the history of the world, from the beginning of creation to where we are at now, we find very few moments where things were going the way they were supposed to be going. Shlomo HaMelech had the Beis HaMikdash for one night, and then everything fell apart. Klal Yisrael received the Torah, and then everything fell apart. Even the tzaddikim, the Leshem says, struggle. So he says this world is filled with all sorts of difficulties. And the reason for that is because it came into being through difficulty. It came into being through struggle and breaking. But what's the point? And here's where the Leshem tells us the secret. The point is that it is our job. It is the job of every person, and not only people, but every element of existence, every part of this world that has been, that is, and that will be. It is always in a process of clarifying that chaos. Our lives, our mitzvos, our Torah, our thoughts, our emotions are specifically meant to take the chaos and to clarify it, to encounter the knots of experience, to encounter the doubts and the difficulty and the yisurin that each of us feel in our own particular subjective ways, and to recognize that not only is this not darkness, but this is an opportunity for me to reveal the deepest pleasurable lights imaginable, the lights of Gevura, the lights of intensity, the lights of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence in concealment itself. It's the human being's job to clarify it. We need to live in a world that is concealed so that we have free choice in order to engage it. We need to volitionally choose to reveal the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we know this idea very often from the writings of the Ramchal, that the reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a world with Bechira is so that the individual can choose the good that they engage in. Why? So that we won't be shameful when we receive our reward. Because a person who receives that which is unearned, psychologically speaking, is embarrassed, is ashamed to look the giver in the face. And because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the greatest possible good in the world, and he wants to bestow good in the greatest possible way, so there's a need for Bechira so that we can choose it. The Leshem has a little bit of a different approach. The Leshem says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to be the vehicles that reveal Hashem's unity in the world. Because the human being is closest to what? To themselves. The experience, the encounter with the self, my thoughts, my emotions, my actions, myself, everything that makes me who I am, my subjectivity, there is nothing closer to me in the entire world. As Chazal tell us, ha'adam karuv etzel atzmo. A person is considered as being immediate to themselves, close to themselves. And if it is our effort and toil and struggle and desire and faith and stubbornness in the belief of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world that ultimately brings out that light, we encounter that light in a deeper way than if it was offered to us by anybody else. Leshem says that this is the secret of the fact that a person wants one measure of their own work more than 9 measures of someone else's work, because it's the secret of unity. The secret of unity is that everything is contained in a unified way, and that unity is revealed in the deepest way imaginable when I engage with it myself, because I feel it. I feel it. My emotions, my mind, my experience feels it. And so the world came into creation through chaos, so that we are the ones who are capable then of sifting through that chaos with Bechira, thereby encountering ourselves at every moment. And when we encounter ourselves and we uncover the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that place, we connect to it in a deeper way than we can have ever imagined. And this purpose, this process of history for the Leshem, as described in his other writings, Sefer HaKlalim, as well as Sefer HaBiurim. This 6,000 millennia of history, which simply means history as we know it, which appears to be struggle and difficult and painful, is for the purpose that we can actually engage it on our own and connect to it, so that the world can return back to its original purpose. So the Leshem described the beginning, which is the world descending away from infinitude and light into concealment and darkness, the process of history, which is when human beings engage with reality, where we struggle to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light through mitzvos and emunah and Torah, and connecting to previous generations, and connecting to the best parts of ourselves, and engaging in actions in this world, like the Leshem said, that there's no difference between Ruchnius and Gashmius. But the purpose of all of this is so that we can then bring reality back up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Reality descended away from the infinite so that it can manifest as finite. And it's our job as that finite expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to clarify it and bring it back up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that the grand scale of history is a process from the top down to the bottom, and then from the bottom back up to the top. Because when we bring brokenness and darkness and concealment back up to the top, back up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what we're saying is, Hashem, here we are. Here we are with all of the gevuros, with all of the struggle, with all of the pain, with all of the intensity of what it means to be a human, and we transformed it into vehicles for you. We found you in the gevuros, we found you in the choshech, we found you in Shevet Dan, we found you in those lost places. And here we are bringing it back to you as a korban, saying, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you couldn't fool us. You couldn't fool us. You were here also all along. All it was yichud from the top to the bottom. And when we bring that up to Hashem, the joy of that yichud of the future is revealed. That recognition that everything, b'li yotzim min haklal, from the most pleasant to the most difficult, everything, every possible experience in this world was contained within the original thought of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How? Why? Why did it have to be this way? Why did it have to be so painful? Why did this one get to enjoy while that one struggled? Why does this one have it easy and that one has a good time? Those are questions only HaKadosh Baruch Hu could answer. The Leshem makes a very big deal out of the experience when Moshe Rabbeinu sees Rabbi Akiva being killed with the word echad on his lips. And Moshe Rabbeinu comes to Hashem and he says, Zu Torah v'zu schara. Are you telling me that this is what it's all about? You're telling me that this, the gevuros, that severity, those masrekos shel barzel, those steel combs, you're telling me that this is the Kodesh HaKadoshim? This is echad? How could this be? And the Malachim were mad also. And what does Hashem say? Shtoik kach Allah b'machshava. Be silent. This is how it arose in my machshava. And the Leshem spends so much time telling us what that actually means. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's desire for creation is unfathomable. We can't understand anything. All we can understand is what Hashem has revealed to us. All we can understand is from our perspective, according to our mind. The why Hashem does things the way he does, if you begin asking questions like that, says the Leshem, then you might as well sit down, because there's never going to be a time where you don't have questions like that. It's connected to a story that's Shaykh to Pesach. It used to be that the tzaddikim would read Manishtana at the Seder. And one year it came turn for Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, Skusi Yagan Aleinu, to say Manishtana. And instead of reading the Manishtana, he put his head down on the table. And he cried. And the Hasidim weren't bothered, because this is what Rav Levi Yitzchak had done in the past. But he continued crying. And it went on for some time, to the point that it was a tircha, until Rav Levi Yitzchak finally opened up his eyes. And he says, Rabbeinu Shalom, 4 questions, you think? 4 questions I have to ask? I have infinite questions to ask. There's an unlimited amount of questions that I have on you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if you give me the gift of Emunah, then I don't have to ask any of them. That's shtoik kach Allah b'machshava. That's the connection of Rav Levi Yitzchak to the Leshem. Levi is din. Levi is the limitations, the boundaries that surrounded the Kohanim who were chesed. Yitzchak is the gevura of Yitzchak Avinu. Yet we know that Rav Levi Yitzchak was the one who found good in everything, who found light even in the darkest places. Because it's these tzaddikim who are rooted in gevura, who are rooted in severity, who have their eyes open to what the world looks like, who have their eyes open to the difficult process of history, and they see beyond the facade. They say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're not bothered by this. We see you. You can't hide from us. You want to hide, and you want us to search for you? Good, we'll play the game, but we see you nonetheless. And there's only good. There's only Gila, Rina, Ditza, V'chedva, Ava, V'achva, V'shalom, V'reyus. The Leshem Shoei B'Chalaim has a Lashon where he says, all 10 Lashonos of Simcha, they're only revealed through the Gevuros. They're only revealed from those concealed places. And when we bring that back up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're Megala that even when we were struggling, that even when things were difficult, that even when things looked severe, even when things looked concealed and lost, nevertheless, it was Toila Eretz al Belima. Everything was carried by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the Gilui HaYichud. That's the secret of the feast in the future when we partake of the Lavyasan and the Shor Habar and all of these inyanim of Mashiach that the Leshem spoke so often about. It's the recognition that what we thought was darkness was in truth the deepest expression of light imaginable. So we see that for the Leshem, the beginning was din, the beginning was broken and shattered and traumatic. The middle is our process of sifting through that trauma on our own so that we can earn it and that we can feel it and that we can be unified with ourselves. So that in the future, we are the ones who reveal that Giloy of Yichud. We are the ones who say to Hashem, here you go. Here's that brokenness of existence. The Leshem has a Lashon. This is in the Gilyonas HaLeshem. This is the only piece that I'm going to read inside, where he says as follows. I'm going to read it in Hebrew just so you guys believe me that this is written. Inyan ma shekavnasu yisparach shemo sheyehene ha'adam mishalo. Why is it that Hashem wanted us to partake of pleasure through our own efforts, which is the reason for all of this concealment and all of the need of choosing Hashem in spite of concealment? Ki al yedei ze yishapech ha'adam le'etzem haschar v'hamitzvah atzma. Because through this, the individual themselves becomes the schar. The individual themselves becomes the mitzvah. Ubazeh yehiyu ra'ui lehisached bo yisparach shemo. And only through this is it possible for us to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. By engaging the process of this world, we become the kelim that are capable of connecting to Hashem. By undergoing our own shvira, by undergoing our own birur, by using our own volitional behavior to find Hashem, that experience of finding Hashem becomes the schar itself. We experience moments of Hashem's presence in this world. Now, one problem that emerges from the writings of the Leshem, Zchus Yogan Aleinu, this tzaddik who spread this light so far, is that it's very much a future-oriented model. The Leshem tells us that everything will be fixed in the future. Don't worry. Everything is going to be okay, and everything will be revealed to have always been okay. But what does that do for us? Where does that leave us? And this is where the Leshem is very much a student of the Vilna Gaon. The Leshem teaches us in numerous places, based on the writings of the Vilna Gaon, that everything that stands ready to be revealed in the future can be tasted in the present. It's a klal gadol. Gemara tells a story where Rabban Gamliel was talking about that which would happen in the future, how birth would be different, how fruits and their growth would be different. There was one student, an anonymous student, who was making fun. He says, yeah, right. Where is it? Where can we see this? And Rabbi Gamliel found an example for it in this world. And what the Leshem cleans from that is that everything that stands at the ready to be revealed in the future can be tasted in the present as well. This is what Chazal tell us, that when the Tanoim would leave one another, they would say, Oilamecha tira b'chayecha, see your world in your days. Taste Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh. Recognize, as the Zohar HaKadosh tells us, that Olam Haba is really Alma Da'asi. Alma Da'asi Tadir. It's a future world that is perpetually emerging into our world. And that if we align our minds and our hearts and our bodies properly, we have the ability to taste of that. We can taste the future in the present. We can experience these moments in the present. And when a person learns the writings of the Leshem, a person tastes that. When a person learns Panimius HaTorah, a person encounters moments of calmness. When we take refuge in the holy books left over by our tzaddikim, when we cleave to the living tzaddikim, when we connect ourselves to Hashem's presence, even when it appears absent, in that moment, everything is fixed. Everything is fixed. The outside is not fixed. The problem I had yesterday is still there. Ma akhpatli, as Rabbi Nachman would say. Lo akhpatli b'chlal. I don't care about that. In this moment, everything is fixed. That's the power of the Leshem. When a person studies the words of the Leshem, when they cleave to the neshama of this tzaddik and to all of the tzaddikim ha'amitim, what they're encountering is moments of presence where everything is fixed in that moment. And a person can sit and they could say, I am okay right now. It's a bechina of Purim. Purim is very much connected to the Shevet of Dan. The Gra points out that there are 54 times that the name Haman is expressed in the Megillah, which is why there are 54 letters in 54 words in Al Hanisim, and that's the gematria of Dan, because Dan is attacked by Amalek. Leshem Shabbai V'Achloima, the Rosh Tevos, Lamed Shin Vav, is also the gematria of Purim, 336. Because in truth, the Leshem is this light of Purim, this light of the Hippuch, this light of taking severity and transforming it into light. Now, typically speaking, these lights of Panimius HaTorah, these lights of Geula, this tasting of the future in the present, which the Baal Shem Tov and the Tzaddikim HaMitim revealed to us, the ability to experience Mashiach even before he comes, typically that's relegated to those who are worthy. Typically that's set aside for those who have prepared themselves properly. And here is where the Leshem lets us in on a secret. The Leshem saw his time period as a time period where everything was permitted, where we were allowed now to study these teachings. Because something happened, the Leshem says, in the year 1840. Something happened in the year 1840, Shnas Tafresh, which the Zohar HaKadosh in Parshas Noach describes as the floodwaters opening up and descending into the world, of Kedusha, of Tahara. The Meshiloach makes a big asek out of this. As people who follow 1840, that podcast of David Bashevkin understand, 1840 is a significant year. And the Leshem writes as follows. The Leshem writes, and this is my translation, so it's a rough translation. Permission has been granted to all of those who engage this wisdom to understand these ideas, each person according to their own subjective level. Specifically from the year Tafresh, which is 1840 and onwards, as it is written in the Zohar, and in the 600th year of the 600th millennia, the gates of higher wisdom, Chachma Ilah, were opened. And what the Zohar meant, says the Leshem, in writing opened, this means to say that permission has been granted to all of those who yearn to cleave with the living God, Elokim Chaim, to engage in Chachmas HaEmes, to enter and to utilize the name properly. And anyone who delves into the matter will be enlightened to find that this was not the case before the year 1840. It simply was not the case, because then it was still hidden and enclosed, except for a few exceptional individuals. So have I heard in the name of the Gaon and the Chassid, Rav Yisrael Salanter Schusei Yogan Aleinu. And all of this is rooted in the revelation of the Or HaGanuz, that concealed light that is existing at every moment in this world, that is revealed above and draws down below to the point that we can taste it in this world. So what was unique about this year 1840? So the Leshem was born in the year 1841. It's through the Leshem's writings that we have access. The Leshem's writings themselves reveal everything to us. They teach us how to find the Or HaGanuz in our existence, how to uncover the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinity that is hiding behind the curtains, that is hidden behind Gashmias, that is hidden behind difficulty. And it's this tzaddik who tells us that we have permission now to see the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't have to hide anymore. We don't have to play the game anymore. We get to say to Hashem, I see you here. It hurts? Okay, I still see you. It's difficult? I still see you. I'm silent. Kach Allah b'machshava. It's your machshava, Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's your Naira Alila. It's your process, but I believe deeply without fail, Hashem, that you're present in every element of existence. This was the light of the Leshem. And this is why it's incumbent on us to benefit from the light of this tzaddik. Now, again, when a person learns the writings of Rav Kook, they're also tasting from the lights of this tzaddik. When a person studies the writings of the Balei Musar, they're also tasting from the lights of this tzaddik. When somebody studies the writings of Rav Yitzchak Meyer Morgenstern Shlita or the other tzaddikim in our generation, they're tasting from the Leshem Shuvay V'Chaloima. The Leshem allowed all of us to become his students. And he gave us all a certain requirement to study these teachings. We can no longer claim that we can't understand them. I promise you, if a person opens up the book of Hakdamus Sha'arim, you will understand. Some parts you won't understand, but everybody has access. We live in a time now where we are so sick that we need this light to heal us. And it's the light of the Leshem who brings us through darkness back up to the light to reveal that even darkness is light, to be Megala this Tosefes Kishut. And on the Yahrtzeit of this tzaddik, we should all merit through the schus of the Refuah Shalema and the Eloi Neshama of the individuals who sponsored this year, and in the light of the programs, Meaningful Minute, Ludugma, which are perpetuating this process of spreading the light of Torah, of shining the light that Or HaGanuz is for all to see, to take up the mantle and the command and the need of the hour, to descend deeply into the teachings of our tradition, to believe that we have shaychus to Pnimiyas HaTorah. And sometimes it's specifically because we're so sick that we need this medicine. The Ktsois HaChoshen famously came to the Zidichava Rebbe, and he said to him, tell me exactly what Hasidus is again. How could you be taking Kabbalah and spreading it forth so freely? Are you not worried about its respect? Are you not worried about it being trampled upon? And the Zidichover gave an example. He said there was a king who had a child who was incredibly ill. And all of the doctors in the land came to try and heal him with different forms of medicines. Nothing was working. Until there was one last doctor who came along and said, King, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is your son can be healed. The bad news is that the medicine is dependent on that gem that sits at the center of your crown. We need to grind it up. We need to make it ugly. We need to make it bitter. We need to add it into all different types of ingredients. But that's how he'll be cured. And the king, without even blinking an eye, says, take my crown. That's what Hasidus is. That's what Pnimiyas HaTorah is. That's what the light of the tzaddikim is. It's Hashem saying to us, Chevra, I understand you're sick, but here, take the medicine. The medicine is here in front of you. The Sama D'Chaim, the breath of life, the medicine of life is here. It's in the writings. It's revealed to us. And it's the tzaddikim like the Leshem, Rav Shlomo ben Chaim Chaikel, Schusi Yagan Aleinu, who give us the ability to open our mouths and say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I can understand just a little bit. I can understand you, and I can find that you're here in the darkness as well. And Be'ezrus Hashem, in the schus of the Leshem and his neshama and his Torah and his writings and the Talmidim and his Mamshichei Darcho and all of the tzaddikim that preceded him and follow him, that we should be zochet to be toim the tam of the Or HaGanuz, to believe that we can taste that concealed light even now. Even as we sit in exile, in the depths of exile, in our minds we can live moments of clarity, moments of Oilemecha Tira B'chayecha, and the neshama should have an aliyah, and everybody should have refuah shalema. And in the schus of this tzaddik's neshama, we should all be makusher a little bit more to that or haganas until the time where it's no longer ganas, to the point where it's ayin ba'ayin, that when we see it eye to eye, where we no longer need to believe in it because we'll see it so clearly and presently in our lives. Be'ezras Hashem.